All right, folks, we've got a regular visitor to our studios now. Although, actually, this is your first time in the studio.
Yeah, first time here, officially.
Because we've been with you in Walterboro
Yep.
at the State House, and now here. It's almost like we're stalking you a little bit, Candace.
A little bit. That's all right. That's all right.
We are grateful for your time. You're always such a knowledgeable guest on a wide array of subjects. But I wanted to start this week. You guys recently put out some report cards for members of the South Carolina legislature. I remember getting these and thinking, wow, these are very high grades. I don't know if I would have graded them quite so highly, but
Sure.
walk us through some of these rankings and why you felt that members of the General Assembly deserved those grades that you gave them.
Yeah, so I would say deserved is probably, I don't know if that's the word I would use, deserved. I would say earned, right? So
Okay.
like you think about a report card in school, getting graded on your assignments, and that's what this is, absolutely. So we put out what we call key vote alerts when members are on the floor and there's a bill that's coming up for a vote. Sometimes we also do it in committee, pending the priority of the bill for us. So Certificate of Need was one that we graded all the way through the process for these guys. So with these votes, we will lean into, hey, we think you should support this bill or oppose this bill. Here's our principled reason as to why, and we're giving you the heads up that this may or may not show up on our end of session scorecard. Choice is yours from there. We all have free will. And so for a number of folks this year, they really leaned into Certificate of Need repeal, leaned into occupational licensing reform. We saw some transformative things happen at the State House that we haven't in previous years. So these are not grades that are just given abstractly of like, this person's a good lawmaker, let's give them an A. It is absolutely like, where do they align with Americans for Prosperity? One. Two, like, where are they looking to push transformative policies in the state to make South Carolina a really solid place to work, live, raise a family? What does that look like? Are they removing governmental barriers for folks? And that is the key for a lot of these scores. And so we can only grade the bills that, let's say, leadership allows to come to the floor in some of these chambers because of how that process works. So there were folks this year who had an A with us before, or even had 100 with us before, the speaker being one who had never had 100 prior to this session. So we grade each session individually, and then we also do a lifetime scoring. So you could take someone's score, maybe they had 100 this session, a 70 last session. If you go look at our website at scscorecard.com, you can also check out like what their average lifetime score is with us. So our hope is that voters will use this to continue to put pressure on their elected officials to have transformative policy change, not just at the State House, but maybe their elected official just doesn't show up for work and skirts a lot of votes. And I've gotten some calls about that from some
names
folks
on the list that did that.
Yeah, there's some names who have done that. And so we can only grade them on bills that they actually show up to vote for.
Got to show up for work.
We got to show up for work. And so we had some folks who had a lower grade this year, but they missed 5 or 6 votes. And so, their constituents are going to see that. And that's up to their constituents as to how they want to handle that situation.
I also want to ask you this about the rankings. I ended up not being too frustrated with them because I noted that 2 of the individuals who scored literally off the chart, one I think had 113, one of them had 106. I never got over an 80 in my schooling, so I don't know how you could get over 100. But Wes Clymer and Senator Tom Davis, 2 guys have been very pro-free market throughout their political careers, their time in public life. Walk us through those 2 guys and why they were so higher on that list this year.
Yeah, so in addition to scoring the bills as they come to the floor and what those actual votes look like, we give extra credit for folks who are primary bill sponsors on a bill that we support. Similarly, if you're the primary bill sponsor on a bill that we oppose, we do deduct points from that.
Wow.
You should not be pushing such legislation.
Tough crowd, everybody.
Yes. But both of those gentlemen for years have scored at the top of our scorecard. And so this is an opportunity to where, they're the primary sponsor on maybe the Certificate of Need bill, primary sponsor on medical cannabis, primary sponsor on scope of practice expansion, and the occupational licensing, like the list goes on and on and on. And so that's how you get those extra credit points. So I have had lawmakers call me and ask the same question. How can I get over 100? Could you maybe not give these bill ideas to these guys? Can I take some of these bill ideas? I'm like, they brought them to us. So if you are a current lawmaker and you have a bill idea, bring it it to us. We'll score it ahead of session and review it for you, and then potentially help you champion it all the way through. We want to be a resource for things that are going on at the State House.
It's an incentive for them to file good legislation.
Absolutely. File good legislation. Let's stop filing the trashy legislation.
Speaking of some legislation that came out, and obviously we've talked about Certificate of Need, which repeals some onerous governmental bureaucratic mandates in the healthcare industry that were stifling competition. You talked about occupational licensing reform, giving a lot of people a second chance to find gainful employment in a state where there are some people with criminal records that are trying to turn their life around. Those were two big deals. But let me ask you about a bill. There's a fentanyl trafficking bill that was signed ceremonially anyway by the governor just this past week. Actually took effect back in June. But this is a bill that creates tough new penalties for fentanyl. And this is going to segue you. I think you know where I'm going with this. Our trip down to Arizona, to the Yuma sector, 120-plus mile section of the border where 51% of the fentanyl that enters this country crosses over. Candace, let's, before we get into the border discussion, talk a little bit about this fentanyl epidemic and efforts by legislators to try to push back against it.
Absolutely. This is a crisis that South Carolina is experiencing along with every other state in the country, frankly. And so there has been a rise in mental health issues across the board. There have been, major opioid epidemics where whether it is doctors who are overprescribing or people getting their hands on things that are coming from the black market, whatever the case may be. And so there has been legislation this year to push back on these tougher penalties for trafficking, tougher penalties for prescribing things maybe when they shouldn't be, right? So there's this opportunity in the state where law enforcement, the healthcare community, and the legislature all came together and said, we want to put tougher penalties on these particular individuals, especially ones that are leading to unfortunate homicidal type situations. And so, as you mentioned, in Yuma, we were able to meet with Border Patrol, who mentioned that 51% of this is coming across the Yuma sector, one. But then two, as we think about the drug crisis here in South Carolina, something that stuck with me from that trip is that Border Patrol mentioned, if people who aren't, right along the Mexico border think that this isn't impacting them, they are wrong. Someone can come out of Yuma, hit I-40, head east and be in South Carolina in less than 72 hours. And I remember when we met with Border Patrol, sitting in their office and seeing the map on the wall where Charleston, Columbia, Greenville, Rock Hill, all hot spots for folks who are coming over illegally for drug trafficking and human trafficking, both of which the Attorney General's office has been fighting to address here in South Carolina through various task forces. So, the fact that the governor signed this bill, he sent troops over to Texas to try to help there with the border crisis. It's all very timely, and I'm proud of our legislature and of our governor for standing up and saying, we have to do something to try to stop the opioid epidemic, the drug epidemic overall, and human trafficking that's coming into South Carolina.
Well, it was also not only the Border Patrol folks, the local law enforcement down there talked about how quickly, he basically said, this is our problem for 24 hours. It's your problem thereafter.
Right.
So it very quickly becomes, an epidemic across the country. Let me ask you this, your observations from that trip, obviously your group organizing this amazing multi-state delegation, organizing multiple trips to the border. What's the goal behind AFP's engagement on the border crisis? So
we, for years, have been one that has talked about we have to have a solution at the border. Building a wall across the border isn't topographically. I can't even say it. Let me slow down.
You got it.
It's because of we saw, right, there's mountains here, there's deserts there, we're right on the river in California, the Colorado River. So you can't just build a wall all the way down, but there have to be other solutions. Border Patrol mentioned that hey, we could talk to leaders in Congress and DC if they would listen, and we could have this solved in 2 to 3 days, and that's not happening. They're not even coming down to visit one. So we're really looking to highlight, there are issues that are happening at the border. They impact all of us, as we just talked through a little bit. There's also a massive backlog in the legal process. And so what is the incentive to come across and go through the legal process if I have to wait 20 plus years for that to actually happen? And then with Title 42 expiring and more people are trying to come over, and there's this balance, we learned about that you have to be able to strike between legal migrant workers who are coming here to maybe work in the fields in Yuma or coming across in Texas or California, legal migrant workers who are bringing their kids, entering the school system late into the school year. And then, when April comes and growing season's over, they're going elsewhere and pulling their kids back out of the school system. Versus like those who are coming across illegally. And so striking that balance and understanding that there are folks who want to come and live their version of the American dream. They want to come and contribute to society, or maybe they're getting paid a better wage here and then they go home to their families in Mexico at night.
Good immigration.
Good immigration. Right?
Yeah.
Like, what does that look like and how can we strike that balance? And so this is something that, other administrations, so the Trump administration, the Obama administration, Bush's, right? Like, there's other administrations who have leaned into this and said, we have to actually do something at the border. This administration has been very silent on this issue. They haven't gone down to tour as much. They haven't really met with people who are local to talk about what's going on. And so this opportunity that AFP is providing is to say, like, hey, we want to be part of the solutions on the policy side. We want to give folks the opportunity to meet with Border Patrol chief, as you mentioned, to meet with local law enforcement. We met with a hospital CEO. We met with school district superintendents to learn about what is actually happening. And the people who are closest to the problem often have the best ideas of how to solve that problem. And we believe in bottom-up solutions. So why not give people the opportunity to go and hear from folks who are right there on the ground who could help provide some of these solutions instead of it being top-down from D.C.?
And amazing, the leaders that were down there. I remember the president of the Iowa State Senate was there as part of that delegation from Iowa. One of the things I noticed, Candace, and tell me if this struck you as well, but I remember flying over the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona, and then as you come down to Yuma, you see it's almost like the Garden of Eden. You see this green everywhere, and we learned later that Yuma is responsible, particularly during the winter months, for providing like 90%, 95% of the green vegetables consumed on our entire continent. I mean, this is a place that is feeding our country, and it's doing so relying on migrant workers. So you completely shut that down. We're not eating.
Right.
So that really struck me. But let me ask you this. You talked about the backlogs. There's backlogs on the visa side. There's also backlogs on the immigration courts. How do we start to tackle those two huge problems?
Well, on the visa side, I think in particular, we take a look at like the HB2 visas because and I didn't know this until we went on this trip, that the HB2 visas are very specific to what someone can do for work. So if I am a farmer and I have a cauliflower field and I hire migrant workers to come and work the field, maybe all my cauliflower is picked for the season, or maybe it was contaminated and I want to move those workers to work another like type of crop, I can't do that legally. And so like they're only tied to like what their HB2 visa says that they can do. And so one, I think we look into, is there flexibility around that Congress can provide? Because that would have to be done through legislation of, maybe I bring over a worker and they're allowed to work whatever the crop might be in my field and not tied to a certain thing. One. And then two, the other piece with the H2B visas is that the farmer has to provide housing for these individuals. And a lot of these individuals go home at night. And so you're putting all of these requirements on the farm owner to say, like, one, they can only work certain crops. Two, you have to provide housing. You have to provide 3 meals a day, transportation from the border back and forth, like all of these things. It's like, guys, come on, like, let's loosen these restrictions a little bit. Let people be innovative. And like, maybe I don't need to provide housing, or maybe I do, depending on how far my farm is from the border. So I think we take a look at that process, one, visa-wise. I think also with the courts, as you mentioned, there's just a massive backlog of like these cases getting heard on a quick basis. So maybe there's something we could put into place that says, things have to be heard within 30 days, 60 days. I don't know what that time frame is. I'm not an immigration attorney, but I think like setting some sort of parameters around like how quickly a case has to be heard, or is there, is it a case with a minor where maybe we should like expedite that case a little bit? What does that potentially look like? And I remember one of the videos they showed us in the Border Patrol room was of a minor, a baby, frankly, who got dropped off by a coyote and then left the baby there with a white t-shirt on and a phone number, and Border Patrol sees that child. And so, in those cases, it's okay, but what do we do with this child? How do we process them through, the immigration visa process? We don't have a legal adult to know that they're tied to. And then we heard recently the Biden administration has even taken a look and saying, oh, well, let's just not track that some of these folks came in. Like, what?
Ignorance is not bliss here.
Exactly. There's so many problems with that, like drug trafficking, and we're just going to turn a blind eye and be like, let's just pretend that they didn't come over with someone who's not like blood related to them. So it's just like, there's so many things that Congress can do. But I even think our state officials, so here in South Carolina, Neil Collins has filed a bill year after year in regards to occupational licensing for frankly, for like the dreamer population that's here in South Carolina. So if, the any administration decided those dreamers need to go back, they can no longer be here, this legislation would say, well, they can work here legally in South Carolina. They've been here forever. They came here at no fault of their own. Why are we going to send them back to a country they know nothing about? And so I think that there's stuff that the state legislature can do in addition to Congress. But then the relationship that all these lawmakers have with each other and being able to have those conversations and figure out what is best for South Carolina is going to be very different than like what's best for folks in Arizona.
But you're saying, and you talked about that with that bottom-up approach, is that something you feel state leaders should be more aggressive on, more creative in terms of proposing policy solutions?
Potentially, especially if you've got, in South Carolina, we have migrant workers. I grew up in Oconee County where there were apple orchards at the time and lots of migrant workers. And so, figuring out like what works best for each community, we shouldn't be dependent on Washington to tell us what to do. We should figure that out as a state and then tell Washington, like, this is what we're doing, right? Some of this is federal policy, but if it's not working, then why are we like waiting on Washington to come back and say, okay, but Will, this is what I think South Carolina needs? Like, no, we know the needs of South Carolinians, and we're going to push back on that just like we do on Bidenomics and everything else. Like, instead of taking direction from them, let's tell them what we need in South Carolina.
And we mentioned the Iowa Senate president earlier. Obviously, Iowa, South Carolina, these are states where if we're doing something right, that can factor into that presidential conversation,
Correct.
The national conversation. Which I guess leads us into our next topic, Candace. Let's talk about this. The latest polling, if you look at the aggregate, Real Clear Politics, it takes from a bunch of national polls, shows former U.S. President Donald Trump leading the field by about 36 percentage points. Mm-hmm. That is a gap that has ebbed and flowed. Certainly it has expanded in the aftermath of the flurry of indictments that have been issued against the former president. And I wanted to ask you this. Americans for Prosperity Action, the political action wing of your group, very active in making the case that Trump is unelectable in the general election. And I wanted to ask you about that because we seem to be in this weird space where insurmountable lead perhaps on the primary side and then potential unelectability in a general election. Walk us through this campaign, the push behind it, and where do you see this presidential race as it currently stands?
So it's an interesting question because when we think about the 2020 election, when we think about the 2022 election, there are a number of voters who said, and I sent this over to you and you ran it this week, of like, I'm going to hold my nose and vote against the other guy. Not because I'm voting for this person, especially in 2020 when no one actually knew like what policies might come out of that election. But they were like, I definitely don't want Hillary as president, so I'm going to hold my nose and vote for Trump, right? So, as we think ahead to 2024, voters are so tired of having to hold their nose to vote against someone. They want to vote for someone who has sound policy solutions in mind. Both in 2020, right, you saw, the president former President Trump, sure, he won that election and he had some solid policies when he was in office. Some of those policies were already in motion. They weren't necessarily brand new things that he came up with, right? But I'll give him credit. He signed them into law where other presidents may not have. But then in 2022, when the election rolled around, right, we lost the White House, we lost the Senate, we lost the House. I'm not saying all of that is his fault, right? But there were bad candidates in that race, and there were bad candidates that he endorsed, frankly, in that race. And I think that that's an opportunity to lean in and say, the American people are ready to turn the page into something different. They want a different type of leader. They want a leader who can unite the country and not be so divisive on, things. Our country, we have the far right and the far left, and everyone in the middle is like, but where do I fall? Because I don't fit either one of those individuals necessarily. And when, you hear things from Trump's campaign come out, he doesn't really have a plan as to how he's going to win back, let's say, independent suburban moms who he lost in 2022. There's not a plan to win back, the Hispanic demographic that didn't necessarily go for him in 2022. And so, as you take a look at some of these individual demographics, there's not necessarily a plan there. The plan is like, oh, well, they loved me, so of course they're going to vote for me again. Like, that's not a plan. And so, where we can lean in and talk about how terrible Bidenomics is, this administration has just been abysmal on everything, right? And so, people are going to start voting with their wallet. They're tired of inflation, but they want someone who can come in day one and be a strong leader, someone who can help to carry the country, help unite it again. And so that's a lot of where that decision comes from. It's like, we want someone who is going to go into Washington on the first day and say, okay, not via all executive order, right? We don't necessarily believe in executive orders. We believe in these bottom-up solutions. But someone who's willing to have their ear to the ground and think about, okay, what is best for the country? How can we get inflation back on track? How can we, rein in some of these gas prices that are fluctuating so much? How can we make sure that, we're not over-regulating everyone to death? How can we, maybe we promote school choice from a federal level? Maybe we lean into healthcare and what policies need to be done there for people to have more personal options when it comes to healthcare. There's such a variety of things that need to get done, and we need to have someone who can unite both chambers of Congress to actually get that done.
You've used that word a couple times, and I want to zero in on it. Someone.
Yeah.
Who is this someone in your mind?
I don't know. To be determined. I don't know. I think we have the debate coming up in less than 2 weeks, right? August 23rd. So it'll be interesting to see who, if anyone, comes to mind, who is leading on some of these policies. And so what we're really going to be looking for that debate is, what does economic progress look like for these candidates? Mm-hmm. What does healthcare look like for these candidates? What does education look like for these candidates? How can, and what type of tone are they using when they're talking about these policies? Are they policies that remove governmental barriers and get things out of the way so that individuals can live their version of the American dream? I don't know I don't have a magic crystal ball. I wish I did. People ask me this all the time, and it's, maybe there's someone, maybe there's not, right? But it's this opportunity of who is going to drive on these policies. And so many people right now that we talk to, and we have been knocking on doors here in South Carolina since March, talking to voters at the doors, talking to them on the phones of, as you think about the direction of the country, what keeps you up at night? What are you talking about around your kitchen table? Everyone that we talk to, I'm crushed by inflation. I can't afford the same groceries that I bought last week because prices have changed so much. I can't afford gas. Inflation and the economy come to the top for almost every single voter that we talk to.
And yet nobody's talking about it.
No one's talking about it. And Biden is saying, well, the country is wonderful, guys. We're doing such a great job. And I saw this article that Forbes put out this week where Biden was like, the folks are tired of feeling like they're getting suckered. It's like, well, you, sir, are the one who's causing all of this. So I think we just really need to hone in on, what does that look like, and making sure that people feel that they can live their version of the American dream, and they're not just having to live paycheck to paycheck because inflation is so high that they can't think about anything else.
That has got to be the best non-answer. But you're absolutely right. Let me ask you that. I'll go ahead and throw a name out there. I've seen him twice. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. Saw him speak in Gilbert when he made his first big swing, saw his comments on reforming the U.S. military. And again, I'll make a joke that'll get me in a little trouble, but I can make it since I'm a little bit on the spectrum. And maybe that's why I like him, because a lot of people say he's on the spectrum too. Not maybe the best communicator, but I've been impressed by the guy. And he seems to be sort of hanging around in that middle tier all by himself. No one really seems to have creeped up to challenge him in that middle tier. Similarly, he has yet to really elevate his candidacy up to challenge Trump. It's kind of this weird, well, he's just there in the middle situation. Is he one of the ones that perhaps could be the someone?
Perhaps. He did some great things in Florida, right, when it came to education, especially expanding school choice. They have expanded their certificate of need, repeal legislation. I know that they have more things this year that have been repealed. They've expanded a number of things in Florida. Their medical cannabis program just recently got expanded. So there's a lot that he did. I mean, he kept Florida open during COVID. School choice, fought back on regulations coming from D.C. But I think, on some other issues, immigration we talked about, right? Like, people have questions around his immigration policy. And so, I think that there's an opportunity coming up at the debate of okay, how can we hone in on these people and figure out what is the best direction for the country? So, his name gets tossed around a lot. People ask me about him all the time. People ask me about, former Governor Haley. There were some things that she did really well in South Carolina that people like. Does she have the name recognition across the country? I don't know. She was a former UN ambassador. People know her for that, but do they know what she did or didn't do, both in the state house and as governor? Same with Tim Scott. What does that look like for folks? He leans into education. He leans into a lot of economic progress opportunities. But then there's other things that people are like, well, I don't really know how he would lead in a non-senatorial role. What does that potentially look like? Vivek Ramaswamy, all over the place on ESGs, he's talked about a lot about that, a lot about economic progress. What are some of his other policy, agenda items? So I think it'll be interesting to see, one, who shows up for the debate. We know who's qualified, but who shows? I saw Trump may or may not show.
That's a great question.
So, will he run his own, whatever he wants to call it, at the same time that the debate's going on, or will he be there to debate? Chris Christie has jumped into the race. There's all of these, names that are out there of folks, and so I don't know. We'll see who comes to the top of it all.
And not just who shows up, but who shows up, who brings that
Correct.
A game and is able to, because that's an opportunity for somebody, someone we keep talking about. Well, let me ask you this, and we've tried to credit Nikki Haley on this because she has been driving a discussion on entitlement. She's got DeSantis now moving in the right direction on that issue, where previously he was part of that, Trump fold of, let's not touch it and pretend it goes away.
Right.
But, Haley's been talking about that issue, and now DeSantis talking about that issue and having to fix it. And that conversation, as it unfolds, your crystal ball, who do you see potentially breaking through into that second tier, potentially challenging Trump? And do you see eventually an impact of all these indictments on Trump within the Republican Party?
I don't know. I mean, the media would have you believe that he gets a bump every time an indictment drops. One just dropped yesterday. What does that potentially look like? And there are folks who are, very much Trump loyalists who aren't potentially going to vote for someone else. But then there are voters who we've talked to, a lot who we've talked to in South Carolina, who said, yes, I voted for him before, but I'm open to someone else, depending on what that potentially looks like, what those policies look like that person, is pushing for and supports. As far as someone moving into the second tier, I don't know. I think that we have a big opportunity, as I mentioned, with this debate to figure out, what do people hear? What do they like that they hear? And so I'm interested to see how those polling numbers potentially change after the debate. Entitlements is something that a lot of folks are scared to talk about, but the former governor has been talking about it a lot, and has moved, as you mentioned, she's moved DeSantis and some others. And so, part of the policies that we are pushing is one, people can't live under Bidenomics anymore. We definitely don't need 4 more years of that. There's that sense of unease there of I don't even know if I can get enough gas to pick my kids up from school, right? Whatever it might be for individuals. And then we have sound policy solutions of how to fix some of these things as an organization. What does that potentially look like? And there's, as people are leaning into the debate, what do they have to say around immigration, economic progress, healthcare, education, kind of a plethora of issues. but then how does that resonate with people, right? And so I think, my Magic 8 crystal ball,
Yeah.
that this is an election where people are going to vote with their wallet, hopefully, and at least say, we can't do 4 more years of Bidenomics. And if it's a Biden-Trump head-to-head, well, we saw what happened in 2020 with that. So, will that happen again? I don't know. Or is there an opportunity to potentially have a different direction for the country?
And will those no labels guys be on the ballot? We'll
Will
have to
they
take
be
a
on the
look at
ballot?
that.
Yeah, that's what we've seen a lot, especially in talking about, some of the, I don't know if they'll be on the ballot here in South Carolina. Our primary is so early. Will they be on the ballot for later states? What does that look like? And, in South Carolina, we have sore loser laws, if you will, right? Like if you lose your primary, you can't turn around and then run as an independent. We don't have that necessarily at the federal level. So if someone loses the primary, will they then jump in? I don't know. Could get real interesting.
Very interesting. Let me ask you this. And by the way, you're always so generous and gracious with your time. I appreciate it. I know you're busy. Let me ask you one more thing, though. You mentioned ESGs earlier. Mm-hmm. This is an incredibly insidious effort to integrate all of these sort of woke ideologies into corporate America. It's a way to get around having to pass laws and to kind of enforce this agenda. Very dangerous stuff. Walk us through this. And you mentioned you guys have got a little something cooking on that. Tell us.
We do, absolutely. So for those, and you've covered this a lot, especially with Diane Hardy from the Mom and Pop Alliance. I appreciate all the work she's been doing on that and your coverage here. The Attorney General has been pushing back on it as well. But for those who may not be familiar, right, ESG stands for like environmental social governance. And as you mentioned, this is a way for companies, especially in the UK or who are part of the UN, to tell American companies, if you want to do business with us, you have to have this in your like corporate policy to where you follow, these guidelines, these ESG guidelines, if you will.
Carbon footprint.
Right. Climate change, the national
cross-dressing
emergency.
On Fridays.
Right, whatever. The national emergency around climate change that they're pushing Biden to do. But I think, South Carolinians and Americans across the board, they want to be able to determine where their own money goes. And a lot of this ESG comes into play when it comes to like retirement accounts. And then it is incentivized for the financial advisor to pick where your retirement goes or where your stock goes based off of that person's ESG score versus like what is best for you as an individual when it comes to like your long-term retirement financial planning. So there has been a bill here that Rep. Bill Taylor pushed last year that he's from the Aiken area. It passed the House. It's sitting over in the Senate that says that the state pension plans or retirement plans cannot use ESG scoring, that they have to determine like what is best for you as an individual when it comes to your retirement best return versus like how does it score ESG wise, just with all this woke agenda. And so that is now sitting over in the Senate. So we'll see if the Senate takes it up this year. There's a lot of, as I mentioned, there's interest from the Attorney General. Senator Sean Bennett has another ESG bill that attacks things outside of just the retirement planning that Bill Taylor's does. It looks at overall like corporate investment into South Carolina and also leaning into the small businesses that Diane Hardy is part of like how does this then impact small businesses, because it's not just this large corporation has to have ESG policies, but every single vendor that you work with has to then like adhere to these ESG policies, which impacts a lot of our small businesses across the state. So as you mentioned, on August 15th, we are doing an event here in Columbia, actually down at the Palmetto Club, with the Attorney General's office, who has been fighting back against this at a federal level, saying we're not adopting these policies here in South Carolina. Diane Hardy from the Mom and Pop Alliance will be there. And then AFP's very own Casey Maddox, he is our Vice President of Legal and Judicial Strategy, and so he will be there as well. They'll all be on a panel talking about ESGs, what it means for South Carolinians, what it means for Americans as a whole, why this is terrible policy, and what we can do to push back against it.
Candace, Carroll, every time we talk, I end up with a full notepad of stuff I got to write about because I tell you, your knowledge and command of these issues, local, federal, state, political, how they impact the politics. It's just amazing. Always,
Thank you.
always grateful when you take the time to share that insight with us. Can we bring you back as we start
Of
seeing who this
course.
someone might be
Yes,
presidentially?
absolutely, absolutely. So I would love to come back anytime. You and your team are phenomenal to work with, and so I appreciate the time that you guys carve out to have us on, and appreciate you running a lot of our articles in your paper as well. So yeah, happy to come back anytime.
Keep us posted on all you're working on, Candace.
Will do.